You've heard the news, you've seen the headlines. China is tightening its grip on the global supply of critical minerals. The United States and the entire Western world is waking up to a terrifying vulnerability. And right next door, Canada is sitting on a geological lottery ticket, a treasure chest of rare earth minerals potentially worth trillions of dollars. The story is compelling. It's a story of opportunity, of a strategic shift, of Canada stepping up to become the reliable resource powerhouse the world desperately needs. According to Natural Resources Canada, the country holds an estimated 15.2 million tons of rare earth oxides, a vast untapped fortune waiting to fuel the green revolution and the high-tech defense industries of the future. But is this a realistic economic race, or is it just a geopolitical fantasy? Is this a story of a new industrial dawn for Canada, or is it a pipe dream that will crash against the hard wall of reality? The media, the politicians, they all talk about mining. They point to the vast Canadian shield and talk about digging rocks out of the ground. But they forget to talk about the one thing that actually matters, the one thing that defines this entire global power struggle, and that one thing is processing. In this video, we are doing the reality check that the headlines won't. We are not going to talk about rosy scenarios. We are going to follow the numbers, the logistics, and the inconvenient truths. We are going to find out the real price of trying to beat China at its own game. The high stakes of the crisis. To understand why this conversation is so urgent, we need to understand the stakes. This isn't just about iPhones and electric cars, though they are a major part of it. This is about national security. Let's be very clear about what these rare earth elements are used for. Take the F-35 fighter jet, the backbone of modern air forces. Each one requires approximately 418 kilograms or 921 pounds of rare earth materials for its advanced sensors, electronics, and guidance systems. Or consider the U.S. Navy's Virginia-class submarine. Each one of these nuclear-powered vessels needs a staggering 4,600 kilograms or over 10,000 pounds of these elements to operate. Every guided missile, every drone, every piece of advanced military hardware relies on a steady supply of these minerals. And beyond the military, there's the entire green energy transition. The powerful magnets in wind turbines and the high-performance motors in electric vehicles are completely dependent on rare earths like neodymium and praseodymium. The problem is, the West has outsourced its control over these foundational materials, and China knows it. They aren't just a supplier, they are the supplier, and they have begun to use this dominance as an economic weapon. We saw this clearly in 2025. When China merely announced it was tightening export controls, the market reacted instantly. The price of neodymium praseodymium oxide, a key component for magnets, skyrocketed by 127%. This wasn't a hypothetical threat. It was a live demonstration of their ability to turn the lights off on the Western world's most advanced industries. This is the fear that is driving the conversation in Washington, D.C., in Brussels, and in Ottawa. This is why the dream of a Canadian solution is so powerful. Canada, on paper, a resource superpower. On paper, Canada looks like the perfect answer to this crisis. The country isn't just rich in these resources, it's one of the most endowed nations on the planet. The potential is spread across the country. In the Northwest Territories, there's the Nechalasho project, which has already begun some initial mining operations. In Quebec, there are multiple promising deposits being explored. And then there's the legendary Ring of Fire in Northern Ontario, a massive mineral belt that has been talked about for decades as a potential source of immense wealth, including significant critical mineral deposits. It's not just talk either. Some initial steps have been taken. A company called Vital Metals has been working to get a processing facility operational in Saskatchewan, aiming to be one of the first to produce separated rare earth oxides in North America. When you look at a map, when you look at the geological surveys, the conclusion seems obvious. The United States has a massive, urgent demand for a secure supply chain. Canada has the raw materials sitting in the ground. It seems like a perfect match, a golden opportunity for Canada to build a new, high-value industry for the 21st century, securing its own prosperity while solving its closest allies' biggest strategic problem. This is the dream, and it's a very compelling one. But now we have to talk about the reality. The brutal reality, China's processing stranglehold. The dirty secret of rare earths. The single most important fact in this entire discussion is the difference between mining and processing. And this is the fact that is almost always misunderstood. Mining is just digging rocks out of the ground. It's difficult, it's expensive, but many countries can do it. The United States has rare earth mines, Australia does, and of course Canada has the potential. But the raw ore that comes out of the ground is useless. It's a chunk of rock containing a messy combination of 17 different rare earth elements, all chemically bonded together. The real challenge, the real source of power, is in the next step: processing. Processing or refining is a highly complex, multi-stage chemical process that can involve 10 to 15 different steps. It involves crushing the ore and then using a barrage of acids, solvents, water, and other chemicals to painstakingly separate each of the 17 elements from one another. This is not mining. This is heavy industrial chemistry, and this is where China's dominance is absolute. Let me give you the single most important number of this video, courtesy of the U.S. Geological Survey. China mines around 70% of the world's raw rare earth ore, but it processes nearly 90%. Let that sink in. Even the ore that the United States currently mines at its Mountain Pass facility in California is put on a ship and sent to China, because they are the only ones with the industrial scale to process it economically. Let me offer an analogy. Mining is like growing coffee beans. Processing is like owning 90% of the world's coffee roasters, coffee shops, and delivery trucks. It doesn't matter who grows the beans if you control every other step of the process that turns that bean into a cup of coffee. That is the position China's in. They control the entire value chain. And understanding why they have this control is the key to understanding why Canada's dream faces such enormous hurdles. Why China really dominates. China's stranglehold on rare earth processing didn't happen by accident. It was the result of a deliberate state-directed industrial strategy that began over 30 years ago. It's a strategy famously summarized by former leader Deng Xiaoping in 1992 when he declared, "The Middle East has oil, China has rare earths." This wasn't just a statement of fact, it was a statement of intent. They achieved this dominance through three key advantages that are almost impossible for a Western nation to replicate. First, state subsidies and a strategy of predatory pricing. For decades, particularly in the 1990s and early 2000s, China pursued what became known as the white cabbage price strategy. They flooded the global market with rare earths sold at, or even below, the cost of production. The goal was simple: to make it economically impossible for any foreign mine to stay in business. Chinese rare earth companies, being either state-owned or heavily subsidized, could absorb these losses indefinitely. They received cheap loans, cheap energy, and direct financial support. This means they can operate on margins that would bankrupt a private Western company in months. They can undercut any competitor on price, weaponizing the market to drive rivals out of business whenever a threat emerges. Second was the acquisition and development of intellectual property. Over the decades, China invested heavily in the science of rare earth separation. They sent their scientists abroad, bought up patents, and reverse-engineered Western technologies. They then perfected their own proprietary techniques for solvent extraction, the complex chemical process at the heart of refining. They built up a deep well of engineering talent, a specialized workforce, and an institutional knowledge that simply does not exist at scale anywhere else in the world. To build a processing plant is one thing. To find the hundreds of chemical engineers and metallurgists who know how to run it efficiently is another challenge entirely. But the third, and arguably the most important advantage, is what we could call the environmental advantage. And I use that term with heavy irony. The truth is that rare earth processing is an incredibly dirty, toxic business. The process involves vast quantities of hydrochloric acid, sulfuric acid, and other dangerous chemicals. And for decades, China was willing to pay an environmental price that no Western democracy would ever accept. The most infamous example is in Baotou, Inner Mongolia, the world's capital for rare earth production. There you can find vast, eerie tailings ponds, artificial lakes filled with a toxic sludge of chemical and radioactive waste from the nearby processing plants. This waste, which contains acidic compounds and low-level radioactive elements like thorium, has contaminated groundwater, poisoned farmland, and created a stark, barren landscape that looks like something from another planet. This is the environmental cost of the cheap rare earths that power our modern world. It's a cost that was paid by the people and the environment of regions like Baotou. It is a cost that allowed China to build its monopoly. They built their dominance on cheap capital, deep expertise, and a willingness to ignore environmental consequences that would be unthinkable in a country like Canada. This is the machine that any competitor is up against, and we have a perfect historical example of what happens when a Western company tries to go head-to-head with this machine. A case study in failure, the collapse of Molycorp. For anyone who thinks building a North American rare earth supply chain is straightforward, they need to learn the story of Molycorp. For many years, the Mountain Pass mine in California, operated by Molycorp, was the world's largest producer of rare earths. But by the early 2000s, they couldn't compete with China's white cabbage low prices and were forced to shut down their processing operations. Then around 2010, after a diplomatic spat where China threatened to cut off supplies to Japan, prices for rare earths spiked and a panic set in across the Western world. Molycorp saw an opportunity. It was a story that sounds very familiar to what we are hearing about Canada today. They raised over $1 billion from investors, reopened the mine, and embarked on an ambitious project they called Project Phoenix. They invested a staggering $1.25 billion to build a brand new state-of-the-art processing plant in the United States. They were going to bring the entire supply chain back home. So what happened? In 2015, Molycorp filed for bankruptcy. The entire project collapsed into a spectacular failure. The reason why is a brutal lesson in market economics. Even with their brand new expensive facility, they still struggled to compete on cost. The chemical processes were complex, the operating costs were high, and at their peak, they were still sending some of their raw materials to China for certain final refining steps because it was simply cheaper. But the final blow, the nail in the coffin, came when China decided to kill the competition. In response to Molycorp's revival, China loosened its export quotas, once again flooding the global market with cheap rare earths. The price of the minerals, which had been artificially high, collapsed. Suddenly, Molycorp's expensive American-made product was far too costly to be competitive. Their revenues plummeted, they defaulted on their loans, and they could no longer service the massive debt they had taken on to build their dream factory. The failure of Molycorp is the inconvenient truth at the heart of this issue. It proves that in this market, a private company doesn't compete with another company. You compete with the full force of the Chinese state. And it's a state that has demonstrated it is willing and able to manipulate the global market to crush any emerging competitor. This history hangs like a dark cloud over every new proposal, every new investment, and every optimistic headline about Canada's rare earth potential. The Canadian reality check, the three great hurdles. So, with this context in mind, let's apply a sober reality check to the Canadian dream. Canada has the rocks in the ground. That is not in dispute. But to turn those rocks into the materials needed for an F-35 or an electric vehicle, it must overcome three immense hurdles. Hurdles that are fundamentally different from the challenges China faced when it built its industry. These are the environmental hurdle, the capital hurdle, and the timeline and infrastructure hurdle. Hurdle number one, the green trap. The first and perhaps largest hurdle is what I call the green trap. This is the central paradox of the clean energy transition. To build a green economy full of EVs and wind turbines, we need to mine and process some of the dirtiest materials on Earth, and Canada operates under a completely different set of rules than China. The Canadian legal framework for mining is one of the most stringent and complex in the world. It's a multi-layered system designed to protect the environment and respect human rights. But it is also incredibly slow. First, there's the federal level, governed by the Impact Assessment Act. This requires any major project to undergo extensive, multi-year studies to assess its potential environmental, social, and health impacts. Then there's the provincial or territorial level. Each jurisdiction, whether it's Ontario, Quebec, or the Northwest Territories, has its own powerful Ministry of the Environment and its own set of laws and regulations that a project must comply with. A project needs approvals from both levels of government. And critically, woven through all of this is the constitutional duty to consult with First Nations and Indigenous communities. This is a legal obligation affirmed by the Supreme Court of Canada for the government and companies to consult with and accommodate the concerns of any Indigenous group whose traditional lands or rights might be affected by a project. This is a fundamental part of the Canadian legal landscape, and it's a process that rightfully ensures local communities have a voice. It is also a process that adds years, and sometimes decades, to a project's timeline, often involving legal challenges that can go all the way to the Supreme Court. We have seen this play out time and time again. The proposed Prosperity Mine in British Columbia, for example, spent over a decade in the environmental review process before ultimately being rejected due to concerns from local First Nations and its potential impact on fish-bearing lakes. Now let's add the specific, dirty chemistry of rare earth processing into this already complex legal framework. As we discussed, the process uses a cocktail of harsh chemicals to dissolve the ore. But the most difficult byproduct, the one that makes regulators and communities most nervous, is radioactive waste. As the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency confirms, the process chemically concentrates naturally occurring radioactive materials that are found in the ore, specifically thorium and uranium. This creates what is known as TNORM waste, technologically enhanced naturally occurring radioactive material. It's typically low level, but it is still radioactive, with a half-life that can be thousands of years. It needs to be managed and stored safely, essentially forever. This raises the politically toxic question: where do you put this waste? In whose backyard are you going to build a permanent disposal facility for low-level radioactive material? This is a political and social nightmare that can stop a project dead in its tracks for years. When you combine this complex legal framework with the specific challenges of radioactive waste, you get a project timeline that is simply staggering for the modern economy. According to the International Energy Agency, the global average timeline for a mining project, from the point of discovery to the first day of production, is 16 years. A more recent report from S&P Global, looking at mines started in the 2020s, puts that number even higher, at 17.8 years. Let's be conservative and say a project in Canada could be done in 10 to 15 years. That's a decade and a half of environmental assessments, community consultations, legal challenges, and permitting, and that's before a single shovel even hits the ground. This isn't just red tape. This is the fundamental cost of operating in a democratic society that values environmental protection and Indigenous rights. It's a cost China never had to pay. Hurdle number 2, the capital hurdle. The second great hurdle is the sheer cost of it all and the psychology of the investors who are being asked to provide that capital. The numbers are daunting. Let's break down the capital expenditure, or CapEx, required for a hypothetical project. First, you need the mine itself. A modern rare earth mine, depending on its size and location, can cost anywhere from $500 million to over $1 billion just to build. But remember, as we've established, the mine is the easy part. The rocks are worthless without the next step. You then need the specialized processing and refining plant. Based on historical examples like Molycorp and current project proposals, a dedicated separation plant that can turn ore into high-purity individual rare earth oxides costs between $500 million and $1.2 billion. And the most expensive and technically difficult part of that plant, the complex solvent extraction circuit, can account for a third of that cost alone. So you're already looking at a price tag of $1 to $2 billion for a single, vertically integrated mine and processing facility. But that's only if the mine is conveniently located next to a highway with a power line. And most of Canada's most promising deposits are not. They are in the remote, undeveloped north. So you still need to build the infrastructure, which we will get to. But first, let's ask the fundamental question. Who is going to pay for this? Who is going to write the $2 billion check? The answer isn't simple. Let's think like an investor. Private investors, like private equity funds or major institutional investors, look at this and see a mountain of risk. They remember the Molycorp story very well. They know that the price of the commodity they would be producing is effectively controlled by a single, hostile state actor. They know that China can crash the market at any time, making their multi-billion-dollar investment unprofitable overnight. Imagine you're a fund manager. You have a choice. You can invest in a gold mine, where the product has a stable, globally traded price. Or you can invest in a rare earth mine, where the price can be manipulated at will by a geopolitical rival. Which one would you choose? No rational private investor is going to take that risk unless the government steps in to guarantee their investment, either through massive loan guarantees, price floors, or direct subsidies. So then, does the government pay for it? This is the path we are currently on, with both the Canadian and U.S. governments offering grants and loans to kickstart these projects. But this means the Canadian and American taxpayers would be asked to subsidize these massive corporations. We would be paying billions of our own tax dollars to build an industry from scratch, just to produce a product that is fundamentally more expensive than the one sold by the state-sponsored monopoly in China. We are not just talking about building a single factory. We are talking about building an entire industrial ecosystem from the ground up. The mines, the chemical plants, the research labs, the skilled workforce of metallurgists and chemical engineers. All of it has to be created from scratch, at a huge cost. This is the monumental capital hurdle that must be overcome. Hurdle number 3, the timeline and infrastructure. Hurdle. The final hurdle ties the first two together, the crushing reality of time and geography in the Canadian North. There is a fundamental mismatch between the urgency of the West's need and the reality of Canada's pace. The Pentagon, the EV manufacturers, the tech companies, they need a secure supply chain now. They are worried about their 2025 to 2027 production lines. They are trying to build jets and submarines today, but as we've established, with a 16-year average timeline from discovery to production, any new project in Canada that received full funding and was fast-tracked today wouldn't be producing significant quantities of refined rare earths until 2035 at the absolute earliest. That's a decade-long gap between the demand and the potential supply. And even this optimistic timeline assumes the infrastructure to support these projects even exists, which in most cases, it does not. Let's use the Ring of Fire in Ontario as a real-world, tangible example. This is a region that has been hyped for years as a trillion-dollar mineral deposit, rich in chromite, nickel, and other critical minerals. But where is it? It's in the Hudson Bay lowlands of northern Ontario, a vast and remote area more than 500 kilometers from the nearest major city. There are no permanent, all-season roads. There are no rail lines. There is no connection to the provincial power grid. The region is a vast expanse of muskeg, a type of swampy bog that is frozen for much of the year, but becomes a wet, unstable marsh in the summer. It is incredibly difficult and expensive to build on. To develop the Ring of Fire, you don't just need a mine. You need to build a 300-kilometer all-season road through this challenging terrain. You need a potential new rail link to get the heavy ore to the coast. You need to build a dedicated power generation facility and hundreds of kilometers of transmission lines because it's completely off-grid. You need deep water port facilities to ship the materials. The cost of this infrastructure alone is estimated to be in the tens of billions of dollars. And the political, environmental, and jurisdictional battles over who will pay for it and where these corridors will go have been raging for over a decade, with very little tangible progress. This is the logistical nightmare that underlies the optimistic headlines. This is the reality of resource development in the Canadian North. China's dominance isn't just about having cheap minerals. It's about having cheap minerals available today, delivered to your door from an established, fully integrated industrial complex. They have the mines, the factories, the ports, the ships, and the 30 years of experience to make it all work seamlessly. Canada has rocks in a swamp, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest road, and the path to get from one to the other is incredibly long, incredibly expensive, and fraught with challenges that China never had to consider. The sober verdict and the realistic path forward. The verdict, an expensive insurance policy. So after this reality check, what is the final verdict? The conclusion, based on the numbers, the history, and the logistics, is clear. Canada cannot compete with China on price, speed, or scale in the commercial rare earth market. From a purely economic standpoint, it is unviable. Any Canadian-produced rare earths will be significantly more expensive and will take over a decade to bring to market in any significant quantity. So, does that mean the opportunity is just a fantasy? Not exactly. It means we have been asking the wrong question all along. The question isn't, can Canada compete with China? The real question is, what is the true strategic role for Canada's rare earth resources? And the answer is not to be a competitor. The answer is to be an insurance policy. Canada is a high-cost, slow-to-build, but politically stable source of supply. It is a last resort, a strategic reserve in the ground. It is what the United States and its allies will turn to, if and only if China completely cuts off the supply and the global high-tech economy grinds to a halt. Think of it like the U.S. or Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The U.S. doesn't release oil from its reserves to compete with Saudi Arabia on the price of gasoline every day. It's there to be used in a national emergency, like a war or a major supply disruption. That is the realistic role for Canada's resources. And we are already seeing the money move in this direction. The $8.5 billion in private capital that flowed into non-China critical mineral supply chains in 2024, that's not money looking for a competitive commercial return. That's insurance premium money. It's capital being spent by governments and large corporations to de-risk their supply chains and build a break glass in case of emergency option for the future. It's an expensive insurance policy paid for by Western governments and companies and underwritten by Canadian geology. The resonance point. This brings us to the hard question, the one that forces us to confront the trade-offs between our ideals and our security. Given the immense cost, the environmental challenges, and the 16-year average timelines we've discussed, do you believe Western governments should bypass our own stringent environmental regulations to fast-track these critical projects for the sake of national security? Or must we stick to our standards, our environmental laws, and our duty to consult, even if it means effectively losing this resource race to China? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. It's a difficult question with no easy answer. The flywheel CTA. But if Canada is facing these massive hurdles for rare earths, what about the other major resource project everyone talks about? In our next video, we'll apply this same reality check to Ontario's Ring of Fire to see if that trillion-dollar promise is also just a pipe dream. Click the link on screen to watch that analysis next. Standard calls to action. If you found this analysis valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel for more content that goes beyond the headlines. And if you want to support this kind of independent research, you can become a channel member by clicking the join button below. Thank you for watching.